The morning began in silence. Frost glazed the meadow, turning every blade of grass into glass beneath the pale Sunday. The mist hung low, heavy and expectant, as if the earth itself waited for a spark to break the stillness. In that quiet stood a man, a mason, wrapped in coarse wool, his breath rising in thin clouds. Before him lay the first stone, uncut, cold, eternal. He touched its rough surface as one might touch the hand of a sleeping giant. Around him, men gathered with tools of wood and iron, their faces pale with both fear and faith. They were not soldiers, nor priests, only craftsmen called to shape what no one before them had dared to imagine. They had no cranes, no engines, only rope, timber, and the raw conviction that their labor could outlast flesh. The lord of the land had demanded a fortress, a monument to power and divine order. But what rose from the mud would become more than stone and mortar. It would become a symbol of mankind's will to reach upward, to defy time, to turn toil into something sacred. When the first stone struck the ground, the sound rolled across the valley like thunder. Axes rang, ropes strained, voices rose in rhythm, not the chaos of battle, but the chant of creation. And in that sound was the heartbeat of centuries yet unborn. Generations would pass before anyone knew their names. The men who built this place would be forgotten, their bones scattered beneath the soil they once tamed. But their hands, their craft would remain, etched into the bones of the earth, hidden in every wall, every arch, every shadow that still breathes. They were not just building walls. They were building faith into stone. If you have ever stood before a fortress and felt its silent weight pressing through time, then you have heard them. Like, share, and keep the story alive so the stones may never fall silent again. Before there was stone, there was desire. Before the walls, a whisper. Long before the first hammer struck, a single dream took root, not in the hearts of peasants or craftsmen, but in the mind of a man born to command. He was a lord of no great renown, ruling a swath of forest and farmland on the edge of Christendom. Yet within him burned the same fever that had gripped every ruler since the age of Charlemagne, the hunger to leave something that would outlast his own name. To the peasants, he was distant, almost spectral, a figure glimpsed on horseback, cloaked in fur and shadow, his banner trailing like fire against the winter sky. But behind the heavy doors of his hall, the lord's ambition swelled. He had seen the castles rising across Europe and France, in England, in the German lands, fortresses not just of defense, but of faith and glory. He wanted his own. On a cold evening, as snow fell upon his keep, the decision was made. By the light of a single torch, he called for his master mason. The mason was not a young man. His hands bore the marks of decades, knuckles thick as knots, nails blackened by stone dust. When he bowed before the Lord, he did not look like a servant, but like a man who carried a piece of the earth within him. The Lord spoke of walls that would not fall, towers that would pierce the clouds, gates strong enough to outlast war and time itself. He spoke of glory, of protection, of faith. And when his voice finally stilled, he asked, "Can such a thing be built here, on this ground?" The mason did not answer at once. He walked to the window slit, where snow drifted against the stone. Beyond lay only forest, endless, dark, silent. Then he turned, eyes calm, voice low. "It can, but not by gold, my lord, only by men." The Lord smiled, thin and sharp. "Then find me those men." By spring, the valley stirred. Caravans of oxen began to move along the frozen roads. Blacksmiths arrived first, then carpenters, then the stonecutters, their tools ringing through the dawn like the first notes of creation. Word spread across the countryside. A new fortress was to be built. Farmers left their plows, sons left their fathers, and whole families came to earn bread beneath the promise of walls that might never fall. The site chosen was a hill rising above a river bend, not for beauty, but for command. From its peak, one could see miles of open land. The soil was hard, the wind relentless, but it was solid ground, the kind that could bear the weight of dreams. Surveyors arrived, men with cords, stakes, and wooden crosses. They moved like priests preparing an altar. The first lines were drawn, the borders of faith marked not with blood, but with chalk. Beneath the gray sky, the Lord watched, his fur cloak whipped by the wind, his horse restless beneath him. To him, this was not mere construction. It was a statement to rivals, to the church, to time itself. The mason stood beside him, silent, his face unreadable. He saw not just the outline of the walls, but the burden behind them, years of labor, of loss, of lives spent in dust and sweat. But he said nothing. He simply knelt, pressed his hand into the frozen ground, and whispered a blessing only the earth could hear. As weeks passed, the camp grew. Tents rose, fires burned day and night, wagons creaked beneath the weight of timber and limestone. Hammers never slept. The sound carried across the hills a heartbeat of civilization beating against the wild. Children fetched water from the stream. Women tended fires and patched torn cloaks. It was no longer just a work site, it was a village born from faith and a vision none had yet seen. At night, when the fires dimmed, the mason would sit alone, tracing plans into the dirt with a stick. He did not read from parchment. His memory held the patterns of cathedrals and keeps from across the realm. He had studied under masters who built for kings, men who spoke little, worked slow, and believed every stone had a soul. To the mason, this was no simple fortress. It was a covenant between man and time. Every wall he would raise must hold not just weight, but meaning. Every line must echo order, divine geometry drawn from the heavens themselves. He often wondered if the Lord understood this, that a castle was not truly built for power, but for permanence, for the whisper of eternity that hums in well-laid stone. When spring melted into early summer, the first foundation trench was dug. The earth came up dark and rich, the scent of centuries spilling into the open air. Men moved in rhythm, spades striking soil, ropes pulling, oxen groaning under strain. The mason walked among them, eyes sharp as flint. He corrected, measured, adjusted. A fraction of an inch mattered, for in those inches 1,000 tons of stone would someday rest. By dusk, the trench was ready. The Lord descended from his pavilion, priests at his side. A prayer was said. A relic was buried, a cross of iron, to guard the foundations from evil. Then, with solemn grace, the first stone was lowered into place. It did not fit at first. The ground shifted. The ropes strained. But the mason lifted his hand, halted the men, and adjusted a single wedge beneath the block. The stone settled with a sound like thunder rolling through the bones of the earth. The priest made the sign of the cross. The Lord smiled, and for the first time, the valley echoed with something greater than wind, the voice of creation itself. The dawn broke like steel on water. Mist hung low over the valley, and the air carried the scent of lime, sweat, and the promise of something eternal. From every corner of the camp, men stirred, hundreds of them, wrapped in rough wool and hunger. They were not soldiers, they were builders, drawn by coin, faith, or sheer need. Some were farmers whose land had failed them. Others were wanderers seeking bread where they could find it. Yet when they arrived here, among the tools and dust, they became something more. They became the hands of the Lord's dream. The mason, old, steady, unyielding, walked among them at sunrise. He said little, for the work itself spoke loudly enough. The clang of chisels, the rasp of saws, the thud of wooden mallets striking stone, these were his language. Each sound told him whether the wall would live or crumble. He divided the men into groups. The strongest dug and carried. The precise ones measured and cut. The young boys fetched water, sand, and wood. And above them all, the mason watched, listening to the rhythm of labor, like a conductor guiding an orchestra made of muscle and mud. The first weeks broke many. The work was endless, the tools unforgiving. Blisters became calluses, calluses cracked, and still the stones waited. But those who endured began to move with purpose. They learned how to balance a block on timber rollers, how to ease it into place with ropes and iron levers, how to feel its weight not with their eyes but through their bones. The mason taught them not as a master scolding pupils, but as a man passing on an ancient secret, a craft older than any crown. Stone remembers, he would tell them. If you strike it wrong, it never forgets. And they believed him, because when a hammer missed its mark, the stone's fracture carried like a scream. By midsummer, the foundations had begun to rise low walls of coarse stone, each one placed by hand, aligned to invisible geometry. The mason alone seemed to understand. He spoke often of balance, of the line that must hold true from corner to corner, as if the earth itself demanded symmetry. To him, the castle was not merely a fortress but a reflection of the divine order, every curve and angle meant to mirror the perfection of heaven. The Lord visited often, impatient and restless. He rode through the camp with banners flying and guards at his side, his boots spotless while men knelt in the mud. "Why so slow?" he would ask. "Because haste makes ruin," the mason replied simply. The Lord would frown but say no more. He did not understand that stone does not bend to will or coin. It answers only to patience. Still, the mason respected him not for his title, but for his faith in the work. Few men of power trusted stone more than steel, and fewer still were willing to wait for a dream to rise grain by grain. Every day the camp lived and breathed as one living body. The blacksmith's forge burned from dawn till night, shaping nails and tools. Carpenters built scaffolds and hoists, their timber frames rising like ribs of some giant beast. Women carried baskets of food, their laughter echoing faintly through the dust. Even the children played among the piles of rubble, pretending to be knights guarding unfinished towers. The mason would pause sometimes, watching them with quiet wonder. He knew that when they were grown, this same castle would still be here, its stones older but unchanged, its shadow cast over their lives as surely as over their fathers'. The Lord's dream, he realized, was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who raised a hand in its making. Then came the rains. The heavens opened, and the earth turned to mud. Trenches filled with water. Walls softened and slipped. Tools rusted overnight. The oxen sank up to their knees. Men cursed, prayed, and fought the elements as best they could. But the rain did not stop. It fell for weeks, relentless, cold, unyielding. The Lord wanted to press on, but the mason forbade it. "The earth must rest," he said. "If you fight it, you lose both wall and soul." The words angered the noble, but he knew the truth in them, and so the work paused. In those long, wet weeks, the camp became a place of waiting. Fires smoked under soaked thatch. Men repaired tools, sharpened blades, and told stories to keep the darkness at bay. The mason spent his nights beneath a canvas tent, sketching new designs in charcoal. He studied the flow of rainwater, the way it carved paths through mud. Even the storm taught him where strength must meet weakness, where foundations must breathe. He saw patterns in everything, in the roll of clouds, the rhythm of thunder, the geometry of lightning across the sky. To build, he believed, was to read the language of God written in nature. When the skies finally cleared, the valley steamed with mist. The work resumed, harder and faster. The men returned to their posts, renewed by hunger and faith. New stones arrived from the quarry, pale limestone blocks marked with mason signs, symbols as old as the trade itself. Each mark was a promise. "I made this true, and it will endure." The mason touched each one before it was laid. Some bore tiny imperfections, a crack here, a soft grain there, but he knew which could be trusted and which would betray the wall in time. He chose with care, like a priest choosing relics for a shrine. By autumn's end, the first full walls stood waist-high, thick enough to walk upon. The sight was humbling. The peasants who had come as strangers now stood shoulder to shoulder, bound not by blood but by work. The masons saw pride returning to their faces, not arrogance, but dignity, the kind that comes only when a man knows his hands have shaped something that will outlive him. The Lord returned once more, riding through the new gate arch that barely stood. He dismounted and placed a hand on the wall, his expression caught between awe and disbelief. He had imagined a fortress of might and dominion. But what he saw was something quieter, a living thing, born from earth and sweat and faith. The mason stood beside him, silent. "It begins," the Lord said softly. The mason nodded. "Yes," he replied, "and it will not end in our time." As winter approached, the camp prepared for cold. The mason ordered every wall to be covered with straw and timber to protect the curing mortar. Fires were lit at the base of the towers to keep the stone from freezing too soon. At night, the wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the sound of hammers, prayers, and distant wolves. The castle had barely risen above the earth, yet already it seemed to breathe. Its foundations were alive. Its builders, bound together by purpose, were no longer just workers. They were the first keepers of a dream. Long before a single wall could rise, the mason knew where to begin, not on the hill where the castle would stand, but miles away, deep in the bones of the earth. The quarry, to the untrained eye, it was only a scar upon the land, a pit of silence, broken by the cry of ravens and the echo of hammers. But to those who worked it, it was sacred ground. Here, the mountain gave its flesh so that men could build. The mason stood upon its edge one morning, his cloak torn by wind, his beard white with dust. He looked down at the men below, specks among monoliths, and felt the familiar pull of reverence. Stone, he thought, does not forgive greed. You must take it gently, or it takes you. He remembered his first quarry, when he was young and reckless. He had struck too deep, ignoring the grain, and the whole face had sheared away, crushing 3 men beneath the fall. That was the day he learned. Stone must be read, not conquered. The men began their work before sunrise. The air was cold enough to bite, the ground hard as iron. They used no gunpowder, no steel saws, only wooden wedges, water, fire, and will. First came the choosing. The mason and his apprentices walked the face of the quarry, tapping each surface with an iron hammer. They listened. A dull note meant weakness. A clear, ringing sound meant strength. Sometimes the stone even sang a sound like a deep bell hidden within the mountain. "This one," he said quietly, resting a hand on a slab, "it will bear weight." They marked it with charcoal across within a circle, the ancient sign of approval. No numbers, no measures, only faith and experience. Then came the splitting. They drilled small holes by hand, hammer and chisel, biting slowly into the rock's heart. Each hole was filled with dry wooden wedges. The mason watched as water was poured carefully over them. Hours passed. The wedges swelled, creaking like living things. And then a deep crack, a sound older than language. The mountain opened. A single block, heavier than 10 men, broke free, sliding gently down the prepared bed of sand. No shouts, no cheer, only the quiet awe of men who had witnessed nature yield. For every block they took, the mason offered a piece of bread and a silent prayer. It was not superstition, it was gratitude. The mountain gave what it must, but if taken without reverence, the stone turned against its maker. Cracked walls, twisted arches, punishment for pride. The apprentices learned this quickly. They learned to feel the grain with bare fingers, to trace lines invisible to sight. They learned that every rock had a direction, a pulse, a will. The earth, the mason would say, has memory. You cut against it, it breaks your hand. He taught them patience, to wait for the stone to choose its moment. Days stretched into weeks. The quarry became a living rhythm. Hammer, wedge, water, weight. A single good block could take a full day to free. At night, the men slept beside their stones, wrapped in cloaks, fires flickering off the pale walls around them. The mountain loomed above like a cathedral ceiling, cold and eternal. They spoke little. They didn't need to. Each blow of the hammer was a kind of prayer. By the 3rd month, the first wagon stood ready. Huge timber carts, iron-rimmed wheels, and oxen harnessed in pairs of 4. The blocks were loaded by lever and ramp, slow, deliberate, dangerous. A single mistake could crush a man to pulp, and yet they moved with discipline, almost grace. The mason's orders were quiet but firm. He knew that even here, far from the castle, the soul of the fortress was being formed. The Lord himself came once to see the quarry. He dismounted with care, looking upon the pale stones lined like sleeping beasts. "These," he said, "will build my name." The mason said nothing. He thought instead, "No, my lord. They will build something that outlives your name." When the Lord had gone, the mason's men gathered the best of the quarry's gifts, stones clear of fracture, cool to the touch, strong enough to bear towers. Each was marked with the mason's sigil, a mark known only to those of his guild. It was said that if a wall fell centuries later, another mason could look upon its stones and know who had shaped it. The stone carried its maker's memory. One night, as frost crept over the camp, the youngest apprentice, no more than 12, asked why they took such care in choosing. "Does it matter?" the boy said. "A stone is a stone." The mason looked at him, eyes gray as the quarry walls. He picked up a small piece of limestone and held it to the firelight. "See this?" he said. "This one holds air from when the world was new. Touch it wrong, and you break more than rock, you break time itself." The boy said nothing more. From that night on, he struck slower, with reverence. When the moon rose high, the quarry became a strange place of beauty. The pale faces of the cut stone shimmered in silver light, and the wind carried whispers through the hollows. The mason sometimes wandered among them alone, touching each slab like an old friend. In the silence, he could almost hear their voices. Some murmured softly, ready for the journey ahead. Others slept still, unawakened, waiting for the right hand to free them. He thought of the castle's future towers, the archways, the ramparts. Each block here, buried in the mountain's ribs, already knew where it belonged. The mason's task was simply to listen. By the end of the season, hundreds of stones lay ready, lined along the road like soldiers awaiting orders. The quarry had given its gift. Now came the harder task to bring them home. As dawn broke, oxen were yoked, ropes tied, and the first wagons began to roll. The mason watched from the hill as the procession stretched into the mist. The sound of wooden wheels on frozen earth echoed for miles, the slow heartbeat of creation. He whispered to himself, "Every stone that leaves this place carries a soul. May it reach where it is meant to stand." The wind answered, soft and low, sweeping across the hollowed cliffs as if the mountain itself blessed the journey. The road from quarry to fortress was not a path, it was a trial. It wound through forest and marsh, across rivers swollen by rain, up hills steep enough to break an ox's knees. Yet the stones had to move. The castle waited, hungry for its bones. The mason watched from the lead wagon as the morning fog curled over the valley. Behind him stretched a procession of creaking carts, wood, iron, flesh, and stone bound together by faith and sweat. Each wagon carried a single block, 20 men, 8 oxen, and 1 prayer for every mile. They moved slow as glaciers. The wheels groaned like old wood under weight that could not forgive weakness. The first river came before noon, a shallow crossing in summer. But now the spring melt had turned it wild gray water, roaring with cold fury. The mason ordered a halt. Men waded in to test the depth. Ropes coiled over shoulders, sleeves rolled high. The current nearly took them. There would be no bridge. So they built one. Felled trees became crude rafts. Thick ropes were stretched from bank to bank, anchored to stakes, hammered deep into mud. The mason himself went first. He stood at the wagon's front, feet planted firm, eyes narrow against the spray. "Slow," he said quietly. "Let it breathe." The oxen stepped forward, hooves sinking, water swirling around their flanks. The cart tilted, groaned, and then, inch by inch, found balance. Men shouted, ropes strained, the wheels vanished beneath the current. For a heartbeat, it seemed the whole structure would collapse. But it didn't. The cart reached the far bank, dripping and triumphant. A cheer rose, not loud, but deep, the kind that came from the chest, not the throat. Another block had crossed. Another breath in the castle's growing lungs. They pressed on for days, through sleet and rain. Mud swallowed wheels. Ropes snapped like bowstrings. When an ox fell, another was yoked in its place. When a man collapsed, the mason lifted him by the collar and said simply, "The wall won't wait." No one complained, not because they were brave, but because they believed. The castle was more than a building. It was promise-made stone proof that man could shape the earth itself. At night, fires burned along the roadside like small stars. The men sat wrapped in wet cloaks, their faces hollow, hands raw. They drank thin ale, ate hard bread, and slept beside their wagons as if guarding treasure. Sometimes, when the wind was right, the mason could hear the faint echo of the stones shifting in the carts as if restless, eager for their purpose. He wondered if they dreamed. In the morning, frost returned. The ground froze, hard as iron a mercy, for it made the road smoother. They reached the forest. There, the air grew quiet. Tall pines loomed above, their trunks black with sap, their roots like serpents clutching the earth. The road narrowed. Branches scraped the wagons. The men had to cut a path with axes before they could move forward. Every hour, they cleared another few yards. Progress was measured not in miles, but in breaths and blisters. The mason walked beside the lead cart, counting each step. He had learned long ago that in building there was no glory in speed, only in endurance. Stone is patient, he thought. So must we be. One afternoon, the ground gave way beneath a rear wheel. The wagon tilted sharply, one ox bellowing as the ropes went taut. A shout, then chaos. The stone slid, shifting its weight. The wooden frame cracked, screaming like something alive. Men threw themselves forward, pressing shoulders to the block, feet sinking into the mud. The mason joined them, his hands bloodied on the ropes, teeth clenched. "Hold!" he roared, voice breaking the silence of the woods. "Hold!" The stone hung in balance for a breath, then settled back into place. The forest exhaled. When it was done, no one spoke. They just stood there, trembling, listening to the creak of wood cooling in the air. The mason looked up through the canopy at the pale sky. Even stone, he thought, tests the faith of those who carry it. Days turned to weeks. The wagons left the forest behind, their wheels scarred, their ropes black with tar and blood. They reached the open plains, wide, empty, golden under the Sunday. The castle hill lay distant on the horizon, still shrouded in mist. Men pointed, murmuring. It looked small, now fragile, but to them, it was heaven. The mason smiled. "Now," he said softly, "we bring it to life." The road upward was the cruelest. The hill rose steep, its flanks carved by wind and rain. No cart could climb it whole. So they built again ramps of timber, pulleys fixed to oak stumps, ropes as thick as arms. Each stone had to be hauled, one at a time. Oxen strained until foam flecked their mouths. Men pushed from behind, bodies shaking, boots slipping on gravel. The air filled with the sound of wood splintering, ropes groaning, hearts pounding. The mason oversaw it all, his voice low and steady. Pull with the Sunday, breathe with the stone. He had learned this rhythm, the strange harmony between man and matter. If you fought the weight, it broke you. But if you moved with it, if you yielded, it followed you upward. By dusk, the first cart reached the summit. The block was unloaded carefully, rolled onto wooden rollers, then set down on the bare earth, the first of hundreds that would form the castle's heart. The men collapsed nearby, too tired to cheer. But the mason knelt beside the stone and placed his hand upon it. It was cold but alive. "Welcome home," he whispered. That night, fires burned across the hilltop. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the smell of lime and sweat. The mason looked down the slope, where dozens more wagons waited their turn, torches flickering in the dark like a procession of stars. He knew it would take months, maybe a year, before all the stones reached this place. But the hardest part was done. The bones of the mountain had come home to their new mountain, and in that moment, as the stars wheeled overhead, He felt something vast move inside him, not pride, not joy, but a quiet awe. They were not merely carrying stone, they were carrying eternity. The dawn came pale and slow, spilling silver light across the high ground where the stones lay sleeping. Mist clung to the earth, thick as breath. From it rose the hill, raw, silent, waiting. The mason stood alone at the summit, cloak drawn tight, his boots sunk in frost. Around him, the world felt paused, no sound but the wind whispering through half-built ramps and wooden scaffolds. Below, the men stirred from their tents, shadows moving through fog like spirits. It was the day the castle would begin. Not in size or height, but in truth. He knelt and pressed a hand to the ground. The soil was cold, heavy with moisture but steady. Good earth, the kind that would bear weight. He closed his eyes and murmured a short prayer not to saints, but to the nameless gods of craft, the ones that lived in stone and breath and measure. Then he called to his apprentices, "Bring the lines." They came running, carrying spools of rope, wooden pegs, charcoal and chalk, the tools of geometry humble, yet sacred. This was not architecture as the noble imagined it. To the mason, it was ritual. Every mark upon the soil echoed a principle older than any scripture, the hidden order that bound heaven to earth. The first rope was stretched, taut, pinned at each end. Another crossed it, perfectly square. From that single intersection, a world would rise. He taught them the words as he worked not in Latin, but in the language of builders. Measure twice, mark thrice, trust the line, not the hand. The apprentices repeated them softly, almost reverently. Each peg driven into the ground was a vow, each rope drawn tight, a heartbeat. Geometry, the mason said, is not drawing. It is seeing the pattern beneath chaos. He traced a circle in chalk wide and even the future base of the great tower. The apprentices watched as he measured the radius by pacing barefoot, heel to toe, eyes fixed on the horizon. "You walk the measure," he said, "because the hand lies, but the body remembers truth." By noon, the hill was alive with lines, white chalk, dark rope, shining under the sun like veins of purpose. The Lord rode up the slope to see the progress. He frowned. To him, it was a tangle of marks and sticks. He asked, "Where are the walls?" The mason bowed slightly. "Here, my lord," he said, pointing to the empty ground. "They are not yet seen, but already they stand." The Lord blinked, unimpressed. But the mason did not explain further. How could he? Faith was measured differently by men who built and men who ruled. The masons' guild gathered at the center, kneeling around the master as he began the ceremonial drawing of the cross, the axis mundi, the world's center. He dipped his brush into crushed ochre mixed with lime water, painting slowly, carefully. The cross marked the four winds north, south, east, west, binding the castle to the world itself. Its heart aligned with sunrise on the feast of St. Michael. "Every wall shall follow this," the mason said quietly. "Every tower shall rise in balance with the Sunday." The apprentices nodded, faces lit with awe. They were not just marking stone. They were scripting eternity into soil. The wind rose in the afternoon, sweeping chalk dust into spirals. The mason watched them drift, then vanish. He smiled faintly. Even the air obeys the circle. Beside him, a boy no older than 16 knelt with a wax tablet, sketching the pattern they made. His fingers trembled. "You'll forget nothing," the mason said. "Draw it until you see it in your dreams." The boy nodded. This was how knowledge lived, not in parchment, but in memory and repetition, in calloused hands and watchful eyes. As the sun sank low, the lines were finished. The ground was a map of order, intersecting ropes, carved trenches, measured arcs. Every future wall had its place. Every future tower, its breath. The men stood back to look. None spoke. They felt, though they could not name it, the strange hush of balance, as if something immense and ancient had awakened beneath their feet. The mason broke the silence. "Tomorrow," he said, "we lay the first stone. Tonight we honor the line." That evening, they built a fire at the circle's center. The flames threw shadows over the marked ground, and for a moment, it looked like a cathedral made of ghosts. They ate in silence bread, cheese, salted meat, while the wind whispered across the chalk. Someone began to hum, low and steady, a working song that rose and fell with the crackle of the fire. The mason sat apart, watching the stars. He found the North Star and drew a line in the air from it to the horizon, aligning it perfectly with the tower's mark. Even in darkness, the design held true. Every castle, he thought, is a prayer written in shadow and light. Later, when the fire burned low, he took a lump of chalk and wrote in the dirt beside him. The line remembers. The hand forgets. Build as the stars are built. Then he smudged it with his thumb, a builder's benediction. He turned toward the half-built camp, where men slept beside wagons, their faces gray with exhaustion. He knew that soon the lines would vanish beneath stone, but it didn't matter. The geometry would live inside the walls, unseen but eternal, the soul of symmetry. In the morning, they would begin the foundation. Ropes would be replaced by trenches, chalk by mortar, ideas by stone. And when travelers, centuries later, walked through the castle gate, they would never know that beneath their feet lay a perfect cross, a geometry aligned to heaven, carved into the bones of the earth. But the mason would know. He always would. He looked once more to the horizon, where the first stars trembled in the dusk, and he whispered, to no one and to everything, God made the world from chaos. We build from dust in his image. Dawn came quietly again, this time red and cold. The mist had thinned, burned away by the low winter Sunday. The hill stood bare now, its measured lines glinting with frost-white ropes crossing like the veins of an ancient heart waiting to beat. Men gathered along the chalk marks, spades and picks in hand. Their breath hung in clouds above the earth. The air smelled of soil, sweat and wood smoke, the scent of beginnings. The mason stood at the center, where the great tower's circle was drawn. His eyes followed the curve with the patience of one reading scripture. Around him, the apprentices waited for his word. He nodded once. Begin. The first blow struck. A pick split the ground, and the sound carried like thunder over the valley. Then another, and another. The rhythm grew steady, solemn, the heartbeat of creation. They dug deep past roots and frost into the firm clay. Every shovel of earth thrown aside was the past making way for permanence. The mason walked among them, watching every angle, measuring every pit with a weighted plumb line. He never hurried. The work could not be rushed. A foundation, he knew, was not just the base of a castle, it was its faith made physical. If the earth was uncertain, no wall could endure. He had seen castles fall before fine walls and noble dreams reduced to dust because their makers forgot the first rule. Stone cannot forgive what earth cannot hold. So he measured again and again until the cords hung perfectly straight, until the trench walls stood true. By noon, the diggers' faces were streaked with mud. The frost had melted, turning the clay to slick red paste. But no one stopped. The mason called out, "The earth must breathe before it bears weight. Leave it open. Let it rest." And they obeyed. While the trenches dried, another group worked to prepare the lime. The lime kilns smoked day and night on the edge of the site, massive brick furnaces where limestone burned for days until it turned white and soft as flour. The air shimmered with heat. Sparks danced through the smoke. An apprentice stood guard, stirring the glowing stones with an iron rod. His eyes watered, but he did not flinch. When the fire cooled, the lime was slaked with water, hissing, boiling, breathing steam like a living creature. The mason approached, watching it foam and settle. He dipped a hand in carefully. The mixture stung, but he smiled. "Good," he murmured. "It lives." That was how he saw it, every wall alive. Every mortar mix, a beating pulse binding stones together. He told the apprentices, "You cannot force the lime. You must feed it air and time. Mortar made in anger will crack with the first frost." They nodded, memorizing the wisdom that would never be written. By the second evening, the trenches were ready. The wind had dried the clay walls, and the smell of the lime still hung in the air. Under the pale light of dusk, the mason led the men to the tower's circle. In his hands, he carried a single cube of stone, perfectly shaped, pure limestone, its edges sharp as truth. The cornerstone, it would be placed first, unseen once the walls rose, yet everything would depend on it. Every line, every tower, every chamber would take its measure from this one point. The Lord came to witness. He dismounted in silence, his cloak heavy with fur and frost. A monk walked beside him, carrying a silver crucifix and a small flask of holy water. The mason waited until they stood before him. Then he knelt and set the stone on the ground beside the trench. The monk murmured a blessing in Latin, sprinkling the stone with cold drops that hissed softly as they touched the lime dust. The noble watched, unmoving. His eyes were fixed on the block not with reverence, but with hunger. To him, this was not just a stone. It was a promise that his name would outlast his bones. The mason felt the weight of that silence, the unspoken truth between ruler and maker. Both sought immortality, but in different ways. He said, quietly, to no one in particular, a lord seeks memory in blood. A mason finds it in stone. Then he lifted the cornerstone himself. It was heavier than it looked, but he did not ask for help. He lowered it carefully into place, aligning it to the sacred cross drawn beneath the soil. The edges met the lines perfectly true north, true east. He pressed his palm against the cool surface. It felt like the earth had taken its first breath. The men began to lay the footing stones thick, rough blocks fitted together with coarse lime mortar. The work was quiet, precise. Each stone had to find its rest not forced, but settled by touch and gravity. The mason checked each one with his plumb line and straight edge. Every foundation must speak in silence, he said. If it hums beneath your feet, it will never fall. The apprentices listened, though they did not yet understand. They only saw stones and dirt. But he heard rhythm, the slow chant of creation made solid. Night fell before the work was done. Torches burned in iron brackets, their flames bending in the wind. The men's shadows flickered across the trench walls, moving like echoes of another world, builders from centuries before, building again through borrowed hands. The mason stood back at last, his body aching, his cloak stiff with frost. He looked down into the trenches, where the first layer of foundation glimmered faintly under the torchlight. He felt no pride, only stillness. For in that moment, beneath the stars, he understood what they built was not a castle. It was the earth learning to hold faith. When the others had gone to sleep, he stayed behind. The night was windless. The only sound was the slow creak of timber and the faint hiss of cooling lime. He knelt beside the cornerstone again. From his pouch, he drew a small object, a shard of flint, worn smooth by years of work. It was his first tool, the one his father had given him when he was a boy. He placed it beneath the stone, sealing it forever in the foundation. A secret, a memory, not for glory, but to remind the earth who had touched it first. He whispered a final vow. May these walls rise clean. May no false line shame the stone. And may those who walk above never forget the hands below. Then he stood and turned toward the dark outline of the unfinished castle. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled a lonely sound, carried through the cold. He smiled faintly. The world beyond the lines could keep its chaos. Here, in the marked earth, there was order. There was faith. And tomorrow, when the frost lifted, the walls would begin to climb toward heaven. The morning broke hard and cold over the half-born walls. Frost glazed the timber scaffolds, ropes hung stiff as iron, and the sound of hammers was a kind of heartbeat through the mist. The foundations were set now, a silent promise beneath the soil. But above them, nothing yet reached toward heaven. The mason knew what came next would test not faith, but ingenuity. He stood in the shadow of the rising curtain wall, his cloak drawn tight. In his hand, a length of hemp rope, coarse, twisted, frayed from use. He rubbed it between his palms and stared at it as though it were a living thing. Wood and rope. he said quietly to his apprentices. "That's all a man has between earth and sky. And yet somehow, those two things would lift stone higher than 10 men standing on each other's shoulders." The masons and carpenters gathered around a great frame of oak, a skeleton of beams and pegs that rose like a cage. Within it lay the heart of their creation, a treadwheel, 20 feet wide, its ribs bound by thick dowels, its floor lined with rough planks. 2 men could walk inside it, side by side, their steps turning the wheel, their weight pulling ropes that wound around a central axle. It was the first true machine of their age, born not from iron, but from faith in wood and geometry. The carpenter, a thick-shouldered man with sawdust in his beard, tested the frame with a wooden mallet. Each strike echoed like thunder. The mason watched, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Every beam mattered. Every joint meant life or death. Once, in another castle far away, he had seen a wheel collapse mid-lift. The ropes had snapped like whips. Men had fallen like leaves. The sound of their bones had haunted him since. Now he would not let that happen again. He ordered the apprentices to grease the axle with animal fat, to test the pulleys one by one. Each pulley creaked under strain but held. The wheel was ready. At noon, the men gathered for the first lift. The sun had burned through the fog, and the stones glowed pale as bone. They had chosen one block, a great ashlar cut from the quarry's heart, nearly a ton of limestone, smooth-faced, perfect. The ropes were looped through iron hooks, threaded over pulleys fixed to the scaffolding, and tied to the axle of the treadwheel. The mason gave the signal. 2 men stepped inside the wheel. "Walk," he said. Slowly, they began to move. The wheel groaned, the ropes tightened, and the stone trembled as it left the earth. 1 step, 2, 3. The men inside leaned forward, pushing with their weight, their breath echoing against the wooden ribs. The wheel turned faster. The rope sang. The stone rose, inch by inch, into the air. For a moment, the world held its breath. Every eye was on that block, the first to climb toward heaven. The mason watched its ascent like a prayer answered. The ropes stretched, humming with tension. The pulleys whined. Dust fell from the beams like ash from a dying fire. Then, with one final heave, the stone reached its resting height. The apprentices steadied it with poles. The masons swung it gently into place, guiding it down with a thud that echoed through the unfinished walls. Silence followed. The mason stepped forward, his boots crunching frost. He placed a hand on the stone, feeling the faint vibration of the wheel's labor still within it. "Alive," he whispered. "The stone is alive now." A cheer went up, brief, rough, honest, not for glory, but for survival. They had lifted the first giant. By sunset, the wheel turned again and again, slower now, the men's legs trembling from the endless march. Each stone rose like a sun and settled into its place, the walls growing from the ground like a mountain remembering its shape. The rhythm of the wheel became the rhythm of the day. Men inside walked until they could no longer feel their feet. Outside, others hauled ropes, adjusted pulleys, hammered wedges, and filled joints with mortar still warm from the lime kilns. The air smelled of wood smoke, sweat, and dust. Every sound blended into a kind of music, the creak of ropes, the clang of chisels, the deep hum of labor that no one had words for. When night fell, the mason stayed behind again. He climbed the scaffolding slowly, his hands raw, his joints aching. From the top, he could see the treadwheel below, a dark circle turning under torchlight, the men inside moving like shadows of eternity. Above him, the half-built tower cut against the stars. He thought of the monk's geometry, the sacred proportions that bound heaven to earth. But standing there, amid ropes and sawdust, he knew the truth. Faith was not in numbers. It was in the rhythm of men who refused to stop. He whispered into the cold, "They say God built the world with a word. We build ours with a wheel." Down below, the carpenter was still awake, tightening the wheel's ropes. He looked up, saw the mason watching from above, and grinned. "Tomorrow," he called, We lift 2 stones at once. The mason smiled faintly. If the ropes hold, the carpenter shrugged. If they don't, we make better ones. That was how it was. In that world, failure wasn't the end, it was the teacher. By the next dawn, the castle began to take its true shape. The wheel turned without pause, lifting stone after stone into the air. The towers rose like pillars of light, their shadows stretching long across the fields. Peasants in nearby villages stopped to watch, their eyes wide with disbelief. How could men with no cranes, no iron, no magic raise mountains? The answer was there, in the rhythm of the treadwheel, in the slow, patient song of wood and rope and breath. Weeks later, when the walls reached a man's height, the mason stood before them and felt something stir deep within him. The stones were no longer cold. They were warm, warmed by hands, by friction, by life itself. He pressed his palm against the wall. The vibrations of the wheel echoed faintly through it, like a heartbeat. He whispered to no one, "This is how we touch eternity." He looked to the wheel again, still turning, still groaning, still carrying the world upward, 1 stone at a time. The sky above was wide and pale, and for a fleeting moment, he imagined the wall reaching it, a ladder of faith and labor connecting the two. And perhaps in a way, it did. For every turn of that wheel was a prayer. Every stone lifted was a promise that though men were mortal, their work could still reach heaven. The treadwheel had become the heart of the fortress, beating day and night, lifting stones toward heaven. But as the walls climbed higher, even that heart began to strain. Ropes snapped like bowstrings. The wheel groaned under the weight of ambition. And still, the mason dreamed higher. He had seen sketches in a monk's manuscript, once strange drawings of pulleys upon pulleys, of gears biting into one another like beasts. The monks called them ingenia engines, devices to make men stronger than their flesh allowed. Now, he meant to bring those dreams into timber and rope. The carpenters set to work under his direction. They built not 1 wheel, but 3 smaller, faster, their axles linked by a lattice of gears cut from oak. Each tooth was hand-carved, tested against its twin, polished with oil and patience. When one turned, all turned. The castle itself began to hum with motion, as if it had discovered the secret of muscle and sinew. Above the courtyard, the great lifting frame rose a tower within a tower. Thick beams crossed like ribs, iron pins glinted like veins of blood. Ropes hung from the apex in bundles thick as a man's thigh. The masons below stood ready with new cut blocks, each weighing more than a horse. They were not afraid, not anymore. They trusted the wood, the wheel, and the rhythm that had become their prayer. The test began at dawn. The new machine loomed over them, its gears motionless, its ropes coiled like sleeping serpents. The mason placed his hand on the crank handle, eyes narrowed against the pale Sunday. "Turn," he said. The carpenters pushed, the gears caught, and the sound that followed was unlike anything they had heard. A low, rising growl, half wood, half thunder. The ropes shivered, tightened, and the stone began to rise. But this time, it did not lift slow and hesitant. It soared. 1 turn of the gear equaled 10 of the wheel. What had once taken an hour now took minutes. The crowd gasped, even the birds scattered from the battlements, startled by the speed. The mason gripped the handle, watching the ropes move as if alive. "Engines of faith," he murmured. "That's what we've built." By midday, the castle was alive with motion. The old treadwheel still turned, driven by pairs of men trudging endlessly inside. Beside it, the new lifting frame sang gears clicking, ropes singing, stones rising like prayers through the air. Apprentices shouted measurements. Carpenters tightened bolts. Masons guided the blocks into the wall with long poles and calls of timing that echoed like chants. No one spoke of miracles anymore. They were making their own. At sunset, the lord of the castle came to see what his gold had bought. He rode on horseback, his cloak trailing in the dust. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. The mason bowed, but did not stop working. "Show me," the lord said simply. The mason nodded. He gave the order. The gears turned once more. A block the size of a coffin lifted into the sky, smooth and steady. It swung over the half-built tower, then settled precisely into place. The Lord stared. He had seen men delifting smaller stones. Now, the air itself seemed to obey them. He looked at the mason. "You've made witchcraft," he said softly. The mason shook his head. "No, my lord. Only patience and wood." The Lord smiled not kindly. "Then build faster." And he rode away. That night, when the torches flickered low and the men slept in the cold shadow of their work, the mason stayed awake again. He walked through the courtyard where the machines loomed like sleeping beasts. The ropes creaked softly in the wind. The gears glinted like wet teeth. He thought of the word engine. To the monks, it meant cleverness, invention. But standing there, in the silence between turning and rest, he felt something deeper. These were not just machines. They were extensions of will proof that men could command matter itself to obey faith. The castle was no longer a pile of stones. It was becoming something alive, a machine built of prayer and sweat, breathing in rhythm with its makers. Weeks turned into months. The walls reached the height of 10 men. The towers began to crown the horizon like teeth of a new kingdom. The mason oversaw it all, calculating, directing, adjusting. His hands were cracked, his beard streaked with dust, but his eyes still burned with that strange light. Each morning, the first sun touched the gears. Each evening, the last light gilded the wheel. And always, the sound of lifting, that endless groan of motion, that pulse of faith turned mechanical, filled the air. Visitors from other lands came to see it. They sketched the machines. They called them mirabilia wonders. One monk whispered that these contraptions were blasphemy, stealing the power of God. The mason only smiled. "If lifting stone is sin," he said, "then let me be damned by gravity." One day, during the raising of the central tower, the ropes caught, the gears locked mid-turn, and the great block hung trembling in the air. The sound of tension filled the yard, the deep, gut-born hum of weight waiting to fall. "Hold!" the mason roared. Men froze. He climbed the scaffolding, every step careful, deliberate. The block swayed inches from his head. He touched the rope, feeling it strain like a living muscle. Then, with a carpenter's chisel, he adjusted a wedge at the gear's base. A breath later, the teeth realigned. The gears turned. The stone settled home. When his boots hit the ground again, the men cheered. Not for courage, for mastery, because in that moment, they all knew. They had learned to speak the language of weight. By the time winter returned, the castle's highest tower pierced the fog. Its base was fed by the machines, wheels, cranks, pulleys, all moving in sacred rhythm. From afar, it looked like a miracle. Up close, it sounded like one, the heartbeat of invention echoing against stone. And in that sound, something eternal stirred. The mason stood before his creation, his engine silent now in the dusk, and whispered, "This is not a fortress, it's a prayer that learned to move." He reached out, touching the worn wood of the gear, still warm from friction. For a moment, he thought he could feel it breathing. The wheel turned one last time that night, slowly, gently, as if nodding to him. And in that quiet motion, man and machine became one. The age of muscle was ending. The age of mind had begun. When the stones rose higher than the reach of ladders, the work slowed not from fatigue, but from silence. The hammering had stopped. The gears rested. And all that remained between the cold stone faces was emptiness. That was when the mason said, quietly, "It's time to give the wall its breath." The young men looked puzzled. To them, the castle already was alive with ropes, sweat, and echoing voices. But the master knew better. Stone alone was dead. Without mortar, without the gray blood binding every block, the wall would crumble with the first rain. So began the part no one ever sang songs about, the slow alchemy of dust and fire. He led them to the lime pit, where heaps of white chalkstone waited under wet burlap. At dawn, the furnace was lit, a shallow kiln, fed by pine logs that crackled with resin. The lime burned for days, the smoke acrid and blinding. When it was done, the stones had changed brittle now, hot and caustic as sin itself. The mason stood before the pile with a wooden ladle. "This," he said, "is quicklime, the hunger of the earth. Give it water, and it will wake." He poured a single ladle of water onto the heap. The lime hissed, roared, and came alive, steaming, spitting, swelling like something possessed. The apprentices stumbled back, their faces white with heat and awe. "Every wall breathes this fire," the mason said, "but only the patient can tame it." They slaked the lime for days, drowning the fury in water, until the cauldron settled into silence. The once hard stones melted into paste, soft, gray, and cool as river mud. This was lime putty, the lifeblood of every fortress in Christendom. The mason mixed it with sand fine, golden sand from the riverbed, sifted through linen cloth. He worked barehanded, kneading it like bread dough, pressing out every bubble of air. His palms knew the measure by feel, not by rule. "When it breathes evenly," he told them, "it will sleep between stones and never wake. But if it still hungers, if the lime isn't settled, it will crack your wall like bone." He showed them how to test it. A handful dropped from height. If it fell with a sigh and not a splash, it was ready. No parchment held this knowledge. No book recorded it. It passed only from skin to skin, hand to hand, across generations, an invisible inheritance of touch. As winter deepened, the walls began to drink the mortar. Every morning, men carried buckets up the scaffolding, their boots slipping in frost. They spread the gray paste with wooden trowels, laying stones like prayers, firm, deliberate, aligned with the rhythm of breath. The sound was different now, not hammer against rock, but the low slap of mortar and the creak of timber under weight. The castle was changing its voice from thunder to heartbeat. The mason watched every joint. Sometimes he would stop a man, scrape out a layer, and start again. He had seen walls fall for less. "You think you're building a tower," he said. "You're building lungs. Every gap must breathe." At night, when the moon washed the yard in silver, the half-finished walls gleamed like wet skin. Steam rose from them, the living exhale of the lime setting, hardening, whispering into stone. The mason often walked alone then, touching the surface with his palm. "Warm, still alive," he whispered. "Breathe slow. Don't rush your dying." He had learned this lesson years ago, when his first wall cracked through the heart. He'd used mortar too young, eager to please his master. The frost came, and by spring the wall had split like a wound. Now he taught the young what he'd learned from failure. The stone must sleep. The wall must settle. Only fools rush permanence. By midwinter, the castle had become a city of scaffolds. Men worked in silence, their breath steaming in the cold. Every stroke of trowel, every line of gray, added another layer to the great body of the wall. The mason saw it as flesh, the outer skin smooth and pale, the core filled with broken stones and slurry. He called it the marrow. When they poured the rubble and mortar together, the sound was like a heartbeat through snow. No one spoke of beauty. No one dared. Beauty was for cathedrals. This was something older, endurance shaped by faith. The Lord visited again near the year's end. He stood by the half-built gatehouse, gloved hands buried in fur, watching the slow gray work below. He frowned. Why do the walls rest so long between courses? The mason, still on the scaffold, wiped his brow. Because they must breathe, my lord. Too fast, and they'll fall before your sons are born. The Lord scowled. I pay for a fortress, not a sermon. The mason looked down, his tone steady. And you shall have both. The Lord left without another word. But he did not return for months. As the year turned, the first snow melted, and the lime walls hardened not to white, but to the soft golden gray of age. When struck with a mallet, they rang faintly, like the tone of distant bells. The castle was no longer stone and mortar. It had become something else, a breathing organism that could weather time itself. Visitors came again, monks, builders, scribes. They watched the mason's men smear the gray paste, saw the precision with which each seam disappeared. They said the mortar here was blessed, mixed with holy water or blood. The mason smiled but said nothing. The only magic he knew was patience. One evening, a storm came out of the hills, rain hard as iron, wind sharp as knives. The scaffold trembled, ropes whipped, and men ran for cover. Only the mason stayed, standing in the yard as the sky tore open. Lightning flashed, illuminating the half-built walls. Water poured down their sides, soaking the joints, testing every inch. And when morning came, the castle still stood. Not a single crack had spread. Not a single stone had shifted. The apprentices stared in wonder. The mason only whispered, "It's breathing." As the sun broke through the clouds, the walls steamed once more, shimmering in the light. The castle was alive, sweating, drying, settling into its bones. Every layer of mortar was a memory. Every stone held the warmth of the hands that placed it. The mason turned to his men and said, "Stone alone is proud, but pride falls. Mortar is humble, it fills the cracks, bears the weight, disappears between greatness. And yet without it, greatness dies." The men said nothing. They simply nodded and went back to work. By spring, the walls had reached their full height. The mortar had turned hard as fate, and the mason knew the castle could now outlive them all. But before leaving the scaffold that last day, he pressed his palm against the wall one final time. He closed his eyes. It was cool now, silent, finished, and in that silence he felt both pride and mourning, for he knew every living thing must die to become eternal. When the castle walls finally reached their crown, spring had already greened the valleys below. The frost retreated from the earth, leaving behind the scent of thawed clay and ash. The fields shimmered with early wheat, but up here above the tree line, the wind still carried winter's edge. The masons, blacksmiths, and carpenters worked without songs now. The songs belonged to the early days, when every stone was promise. Now it was duty. The fortress loomed like a cliff born from human hands, rough at the edges, alive with cranes of rope and timber wheels, men hauling, hammering, calling to one another through the mist. But beneath the noise, something deeper stirred the slow settling of a new mountain. Each wall was 3 meters thick, made from twin faces of chiseled stone filled with rubble and lime. At dawn, the mist rolled through the scaffolds like ghosts brushing against the living. The mason stood on the outer parapet, his eyes tracing the lines of the rising battlements. He felt, not pride, but the weight of permanence pressing on his chest. Below, peasants brought carts of straw, hay, and grain their lives, bending beneath the same fortress that was meant to protect them. He wondered if they would ever see its inside, or if the walls would always keep them out. Because that was the truth, no one spoke. A castle was not built to welcome. It was built to divide. By summer, the scaffolds were draped with banners. The Lord had returned, riding beneath the half-finished gatehouse, his cloak snapping in the wind. He smiled now the stone towers pleased him. They looked eternal, unshakable, fit for a dynasty. The mason bowed, though his hands were black with mortar and blood. He watched the nobles' retinue pass, their boots scattering dust, their laughter echoing between the walls. Behind them, the builders kept working. The rhythm of hammers swallowed the echoes of wealth. And when night came, they slept in straw huts outside the curtain wall, shivering under the shadow of their own creation. That night, a fire burned in the camp. Men sat around it, silent, staring at their hands swollen, cracked, stained white from lime. The mason sat with them, his face lined and soot-darkened. One of the younger workers spoke, "Master, when it's done, will they remember us?" The mason looked at the flames. "No," he said, "they'll remember it, and that's enough." A long silence followed, broken only by the hiss of the fire. Then he added quietly, "Stone is our witness. It forgets no hand that served it. By autumn, the scaffolds came down, one by one. The courtyard opened to the sky. The towers stood whole for the first time, pale gold in the setting Sunday. To the villagers below, it looked like a miracle. To the men who built it, it felt like the end of a life. The mason walked the battlements slowly, his boots echoing over the newly laid flagstones. He ran his hand along the parapet. The lime was hard now, the surface smooth and cold, perfect. Too perfect. He remembered the first wall he ever built as an apprentice, small and crooked, the stones uneven. It had fallen in one winter storm. He'd cried then not from failure, but from shame. Now, with this towering fortress before him, he felt the same thing again, shame, not of failure, but of success. For he knew that every wall was also a prison for the men who made it. When the rains came, they tested everything. The downpour pounded the ramparts, filled the gutters, turned the courtyards into rivers. Yet the walls held firm. No cracks, no leaks. The Lord held a feast in celebration. Candles flickered in the great hall. The air smelled of roasted boar, spiced wine, wet wool. Laughter filled the stone chamber that once echoed with chisels and hammers. The mason was there, seated near the servants. He watched the torches gleam off the vaulted ceiling, the ribs of stone meeting in flawless geometry. He should have been proud, but he only felt the weight of silence beneath the noise, because to him, every sound in that hall was muffled by memory. The scrape of trowels, the chant of prayers before a wall's first layer, the cough of the man who'd fallen from the wheel and never rose again. The Lord toasted the castle's endurance. To the work of God and the genius of man. The mason raised his cup halfway, then lowered it again. He whispered under his breath, "To the hands that bled, and the stones that remember." In the months that followed, the fortress settled into its new rhythm. The courtyard filled with the clang of armor, the bark of orders, the shuffle of hooves. The towers became nests for sentinels, their torches glowing through fog like distant stars. But below, in the earth under the foundations, something still moved. The mortar was still curing, the lime still breathing, releasing its last sighs of heat. If one pressed an ear to the wall, they might have heard it, the faint, slow ticking of stone becoming eternal. The mason knew. He walked those walls daily, testing them with his knuckles, feeling their temperature, their tone. Sometimes he thought he could hear the castle speak back, not in words, but in resonance, a low hum that traveled through his bones. Years passed. The apprentices became masters. The mason grew gray and stooped. The Lord built new halls, new towers, and yet the walls, the first walls, remained unchanged. He would touch them often, tracing the lines of mortar with trembling fingers. Each groove, each grain of sand, carried the memory of a day, a season, a man now gone. He realized then that the walls were more than defense, they were confession. Every blow, every breath of labor had been a kind of prayer. And the mortar, the humble mix of lime and water, had sealed not just stone, but the faith of an entire generation. One evening, the mason climbed to the highest turret. Below him, the valley was quiet, the river glinting silver, the village smoke curling like prayers. The castle, his castle, stood vast and unyielding. He smiled faintly. He had built something stronger than fear, older than kings. But even stone, he knew, could not escape time. He whispered to the wind, "When our bones are dust, may the walls still stand." As night fell, torches flickered along the battlements. The walls glowed gold and red, like veins beneath the skin of a living creature. The mason descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing through centuries yet to come. And when he reached the courtyard, he turned once more toward the wall, the same wall he had touched as a young man, the same wall that had once been warm and alive. Now it was cold, perfect, silent. He laid his hand upon it and whispered, "You endure, because we believed you could." The wind carried his words into the stone, and for an instant it seemed to breathe again. When the walls were sealed and the towers crowned, The castle stood like a husk, grand, but hollow. It was a body without breath. Stone alone, no matter how perfect, was not yet life. The masons had left their marks, chisel scars, initials, runes hidden beneath the mortar and gone to other lands. But the master mason remained. He knew the fortress was not finished, not until it could drink and burn, because water and fire were its soul, the elements that would make it move, feed its people, and defend its lord. Winter settled over the hills again. Snow glazed the battlements and weighed on the roofs of the newly thatched barracks. The forge stood silent, a black mouth waiting for flame. And deep in the courtyard, masons and diggers began again, not upward this time, but downward. The master watched them sink into the frozen earth. They dug by hand, through clay and rock, each strike echoing like a heartbeat beneath the castle. He'd seen it many times before the building of wells, the search for veins of underground water, but it always felt like prayer. They said water was the blood of the world, and every castle needed a vein of its own. Weeks passed. The pit deepened, and the sound of the wind grew hollow inside it. The men dropped torches to test the air. Flames flickered blue, then yellow again, a good sign. There was life below. One morning, as the sun broke through the clouds, a shout came from the darkness. The pick had struck something soft, then wet. Moments later, a thin spout of water burst upward, glinting like glass in the light. The men cheered. The mason only smiled faintly. He knelt at the rim, dipped his hand in the cold spring, and murmured, "The castle has found its breath." The forge came next. They built it beside the armory, under a vaulted roof of rough timber. It began as a hollow pit lined with clay and stone. Bellows were hung from wooden arms, each worked by two men in rhythm, pumping air into the mouth of the furnace. When the first coal fire was lit, the heat roared out like a living creature. The master smith, an old man with arms like ironwood, stepped back, his face red with reflected flame. "This is where it begins," he said to no one in particular. And indeed, it did. From that day, the castle never truly slept again. Day and night, sparks flew from the forge. The sound of hammer and anvil joined the language of the place, as natural now as the tolling of bells or the sigh of the wind. The mason often came to watch. He stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyes reflecting orange light. He understood stone, not fire. Yet he saw the same divine rhythm in both. Fire tempered iron as surely as lime hardened walls. Too little air, and it died. Too much, and it devoured its work. The smiths knew this balance as the masons did. Their craft was no less sacred. Each hinge, each nail, each chain link carried the same weight of eternity as any stone in the wall. And when they quenched a glowing blade in water, steam rose like incense. The old elements meeting once again in silent worship. Weeks turned into months. The courtyard changed shape. Troughs and gutters were cut into the earth to channel rain toward the new well. Cisterns were built of stone and sealed with lime-hidden lungs beneath the fortress skin. The mason traced every new structure with his eye, ensuring each angle fell true, each drain found gravity. He was old now, his hands stiff, but his gaze sharp as ever. He moved like one who already knew how time would test these stones. He paused by the well, its rim newly carved with floral patterns. A chain hung down into the shadow below, gleaming faintly. He looked down into darkness, into reflection, and saw, for a brief moment, his own face ripple in the water. He whispered, "Stone may stand, but water endures." The castle had begun to breathe. Smoke rose from its chimneys. Steam curled from its kitchens. Blacksmiths sang under the ringing of their hammers. Guards trained in the yard, their boots thudding against earth once soaked in lime. And through it all, the mason walked silent, observant, almost reverent. He saw how every trade, every fire, every trickle of water was part of a greater design. He thought of creation itself, how from dust and breath the world was formed. So too with this fortress. It was more than walls now. It had a pulse. That night he climbed to the tower again. The wind carried smoke from the forge up to where he stood. He could smell it: iron, ash, sweat, life. Below, the courtyard glowed like a furnace. Every flicker of flame painted the stone in living color: red, gold, black. He felt warmth rise against his face. And for the first time in months, he laughed quietly. Now, he said to himself, it lives. Far beyond the castle, across the frozen river and sleeping villages, men still built and bled. But here, within these walls, something sacred stirred a permanence that outlasted war, hunger, and the fleeting names of kings. The mason knew the Lord would claim this triumph. He would stand before his guests and boast that his fortress had risen. His men had forged it. His will had shaped it. But the mason did not mind. He had seen the truth. No man owned what was born of earth, water, and fire. They belonged to time. As dawn broke, snow began to fall again, soft, silent, endless. The flames dimmed. The forge cooled, but the well still murmured below, whispering its song to the sleeping stone. The mason sat by the edge of the court, the last embers glowing near his feet. He traced a mark into the dust, his final signature, invisible by sunrise. Then he rose, looked up at the towers one last time, and smiled. The fortress had its breath. It had its heart, and in the glow of the dying fire, it seemed, just for a moment, to blink awake. By spring, the snow had melted into the moats, and the castle's stone skin darkened under rain. The well brimmed with fresh water. The forge burned every day. The fortress no longer waited to live, it had begun to breathe. And that breath was fire. Every dawn, the blacksmiths rose before the bells. Their hands were blistered, their arms scarred, but their steps never faltered. They carried baskets of charcoal and bellows to the furnace, whispering to each other as if entering a church. When the first flame caught, they bowed their heads not out of habit, but respect. Fire could not be commanded. It had to be befriended. The mason often came to stand beside them. Though his own craft had quieted, he felt a kinship with these men. He'd spent a lifetime binding earth and air. They spent theirs tempering flame and iron. Each trade was a form of prayer. He watched as molten metal poured into sand molds, glowing white like a newborn Sunday. The smith shaped hinges, locks, and arrowheads, hammering them while the metal still hissed and sang. Every strike of the hammer echoed like a heartbeat through the courtyard walls. The sound was hypnotic rhythm, repetition, faith. He thought, this is how men speak to God when words fail. The blacksmith's work bled into every corner of the castle. They forged door latches and hinges so smooth they closed like whispers. Chains for the drawbridge. Iron teeth for the portcullis. Brackets for torches that would one day light the great hall. Fire turned ore to purpose. It shaped what stone could not. It gave motion to stillness, the hinge that swings, the chain that lifts, the blade that defends. To the mason, it was as if the fortress was finding its voice. By midsummer, the castle glowed at night like an ember in the valley. From far away, travelers could see the smoke rising by day and the orange flicker of flame by dusk. Villagers spoke of it with awe, a place where light defied the darkness, where men worked through the night for reasons no one could name but everyone felt. Some said the Lord had cursed the forge to keep burning until the last tower was crowned. Others said angels guarded its flame. The mason said nothing. He knew truth rarely needed rumor. Inside, the castle had begun to live as men do, by cycles of labor, rest, and hunger. Women carried buckets from the well. Cooks fed soldiers with thick broth, and smoke drifted up from the chimneys like incense from a monastery. Children of workers played in the yard, their laughter echoing against stone once built for war. The mason sat sometimes on a fallen block, watching them. It moved him more than he expected to see joy where there had once been only toil. He realized then that fortresses were not only to keep death out, they were also to keep life in. The Lord, proud and restless, toured his domain each week. He saw the forges blazing, the wells flowing, and declared it good. He praised the men for their service, promised silver, and spoke of wars to come, lands to conquer, banners to raise. But the mason listened only half to the words. He studied the Lord's reflection in the heated metal and thought, "A man's fire burns brighter when he believes it will never fade." And yet all flames fade. Late that summer, a storm struck the valley. Lightning split the sky. Rain hammered the walls like drums of war. The forge was covered, but wind tore the thatch from roofs and sent sparks flying into the night. Men ran through the yard with buckets, shouting, cursing, praying. The mason, soaked to the bone, dragged a tarp across the furnace mouth while embers leapt like living things. He burned his hands. He did not stop. By dawn, the storm passed. The forge was blackened, but alive. He sank to his knees, exhausted, as a single red coal glowed faintly in the ashes. He cupped his hands around it, breathed gently, and smiled as the ember flared again. Fire had survived. After that night, the mason became quiet. He spent hours beside the forge, without speaking. The others thought he was praying, and perhaps he was. He began to see the castle not as stone nor as a monument, but as a living creature, one born of four fathers: earth, air, water, and fire. He had laid its bones. The well had given it blood. The forge, its beating heart, and yet it would never truly be complete. Not until men filled its halls and time tested its faith. In the months that followed, the castle grew louder, fuller. Knights arrived to train in the courtyard. Monks came to bless the chapel. Merchants set up tents by the gate, trading wool, wine, and steel. Every night, firelight spilled from the windows like a promise. Travelers said they could see it for miles, a crown of flame above the darkened hills. And somewhere deep within, the mason's heart warmed with it. He thought of the generations who would live and die within these walls. They would drink from the well he had dug, warm themselves by the hearths he had planned, fight with blades forged in the fire he had tended. He knew then this was his immortality. Not his name carved in stone, but his work woven into every breath the castle took. One evening, when the Lord's guests feasted in the hall, the mason slipped outside. The air was cool, and smoke rose from the chimneys like soft gray ribbons. He looked up at the towers, their tips gilded by moonlight, and felt peace settle in his chest. The wind carried the faint ring of hammer on iron from below, slow, steady, eternal. A heartbeat, the castle's own. He closed his eyes and whispered into the night. Fire teaches stone to live. Water teaches it to endure. Together, they make a soul that never sleeps. The castle had risen tall enough to catch the morning Sunday. Its towers now cast shadows long enough to swallow a man whole. The yard below no longer echoed with the chaos of beginnings. The thunder of hammers and the groan of ropes had quieted into a rhythm. Now came the slowest work of all, the work of endurance. The masons moved with care few outsiders understood. Each layer of the wall was not merely built, it was allowed to live. For stone, unlike men, had its own pace, the rhythm of rivers and mountains, the quiet patience of the earth itself. The walls were 3 meters thick. Their hearts were not solid but filled with rubble and lime, bound by mortar that breathed and settled like flesh. The outer shells of dressed stone bore the weather. The inner bones held its weight. The master mason, older now, his beard silvering, his hands scarred from lime and frost, walked the ramparts in silence each dawn. He placed a hand on the new walls, feeling for warmth, for life, for the faint tremor of settling beneath his palm. He listened, because good stone spoke. If you waited long enough to hear it, winter slowed everything. Mortar froze, lime slept, and men found warmth only in their cloaks and fires. They used the season to repair tools, to carve, to dream. Inside the half-built keep, scaffolds leaned like skeletons of trees stripped bare. Snow gathered on unfinished parapets. Wind howled through arrow slits like a restless spirit. The mason would walk the silent courtyard, boots crunching in the frost, and whispered to himself, "Let the walls rest. Let them learn their weight." He knew the danger of haste. Many a proud lord had demanded speed and seen his towers split before spring. But this lord, perhaps humbled by the storms past, allowed time its due. He had learned that patience was cheaper than ruin. When the thaw came, men returned to work. They climbed the scaffold, carrying buckets of mortar that steamed in the cold air. Trowels scraped, ropes creaked, and the great walls began to rise again inch by inch. The mason's apprentices had grown into men. He watched them now, as he once had watched himself, cautious, eager, reverent before the weight of stone. They no longer asked how to build. They asked why stone must rest, why lime must breathe, why silence sometimes did more than labor. He told them quietly, because a wall that hurries will never stand. Each day, the castle changed shape subtly, steadily. The gatehouse became a fortress of its own, with twin towers like watchful eyes. The courtyard narrowed as walls rose higher, closing the world within their circle. Echoes deepened. Shadows cooled. Sometimes, when fog rolled in from the valley, the whole fortress seemed to float a gray island adrift in a sea of white. Men vanished into mist carrying stones, and reappeared with faces pale from cold and awe. It was as if the castle had swallowed them, only to breathe them out again as part of itself. One evening, as the sun set red across the valley, the mason climbed the west tower alone. From that height, he saw everything: the winding river, the forest's edge, the farmlands that stretched toward the horizon. And there, below him, the walls glowed gold with light, their mortar still damp from the day's work. He thought of every hand that had touched those stones. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Peasants, smiths, monks, carpenters. Each had left a trace, a thumbprint, a breath, a prayer whispered between exhaustion and dawn. And he realized, no man builds a castle alone. Even the Lord, in his silks and silver, could not lift a single block. That night, he could not sleep. He sat by the forge, staring at the embers. The thought came to him, not sudden, but slow, like a stone settling into earth. A wall is like a life. It must bear weight. It must stand through storms. And when it breaks, it teaches those who rebuild it what strength truly means. He looked down at his hands, cracked and pale. They had built more than walls. They had built meaning. By the second summer, the castle's form was undeniable. The keep loomed proud and square. The curtain walls embraced it like arms of an ancient god. Battlements took shape, tooth, and shadow against the sky. And with every new layer, the pace slowed again. The mason ordered rest periods for the stone weeks at a time when no man lifted, no mortar set. Some workers grumbled. The Lord's steward cursed the cost. But the master only smiled. You can rush a feast, not a fortress. He knew the secret few remembered. Stone that is patient never forgets its builder. During these pauses, life inside the walls began to settle as well. Children of workers played in the dry moat. Wives washed clothes at the well. A small chapel was raised beside the yard, its door simple, its cross carved from leftover timber. On Sundays, the men gathered there, kneeling with the same hands that built towers. Their prayers rose with the scent of lime and smoke, and the mason, standing apart, leaning on his staff, watched them and thought, we have built not only walls to defend life, but walls within which life may grow. Autumn came again, rich with color. The hills blazed gold, the river mirrored the sky, and the castle finally stood in full, not complete, but whole enough to breathe on its own. The masons lowered their scaffolds, wiped their tools clean, and looked up. Some crossed themselves, others just smiled, weary and proud. The master mason, too tired to speak, simply laid a hand against the wall. It was warm from the sun, solid as faith. He closed his eyes and felt the pulse beneath, slow, ancient, alive. He whispered to no one, now you may rest. Seasons turned as silently as the mortar dried. The castle, once a skeleton of scaffolds and shouting, had become a creature of stillness. Its breath was the whisper of wind through battlements, its pulse the slow settling of lime deep in the walls. Men no longer marveled at its shape. They worked, ate, prayed, and slept beneath its shadow as though it had always stood there, as though the land itself had grown it overnight. But the master mason knew better. He saw the small cracks, the faint scars where the wall exhaled. He saw the rain slide down the stones and vanish into the mortar's veins. He listened for the faint sigh, that subtle sound only old builders heard when the structure accepted its weight and became one with the ground. That sound meant survival. It meant the wall was learning to stand. In the early mornings, when mist still curled between the towers, the mason walked alone along the ramparts. He moved like a priest through a holy place, touching the stones, blessing them in silence. Each mark of the chisel, each uneven seam, told a story. A mistake corrected, a moment of strength, a prayer answered in labor. The air smelled of lime and moss. Birds nested in the unfinished turrets, their cries echoing in the dawn. The world below was waking, but up there, time felt slower, as if each heartbeat had to pass through centuries before it reached the next. Years had aged the mason as surely as the frost aged the stones. His back was bowed from lifting, his hands shaped to the curve of the trowel. He no longer climbed the high scaffolds, his knees betrayed him, his breath shortened. But his eyes still held the sharpness of a man who could see both fault and beauty in the same block of granite. The apprentices, now masters themselves, sought his counsel less often. They had learned all they could from his words. What remained was what no man could teach: the feel of stone, the patience of faith. He was content with that. Legacy, like mortar, set best when left alone. Below the ramparts, life flourished. The Lord's banners hung bright in the wind. Children chased each other through the courtyard where the mason once mixed lime. The blacksmith's forge rang with the rhythm of creation. And in the evenings, when the sky burned red, the chapel bell called the workers to prayer. They knelt beneath arches the mason had set himself. He would sometimes watch from afar, not as a worshiper, but as one who had already prayed through labor. He had carved his devotion into stone, not psalms. And yet, perhaps, God had heard him all the same. One night, a storm came fierce and merciless. Winds screamed across the battlements. Rain lashed the walls until it ran in sheets down the courtyard. The young guards fled for cover, but the master mason stood beneath the gatehouse, cloak soaked through, eyes fixed on the towers. He watched as the storm tried to break what men had built. He listened to the roar of the wind, the crack of thunder, the trembling of the earth. And when the lightning split the sky, he saw the walls glow white for a heartbeat, and still they stood. When the storm passed, dawn found him kneeling in the mud. His beard dripped with rain, his hands pressed flat to the cold stone. The fortress had not yielded. Not a crack, not a crumble. He smiled. "The wall endures," he whispered, "and so shall I through it." That summer, pilgrims began to pass through the valley. They spoke of miracles, of towers that defied the wind, of walls built so perfectly that birds would not nest in their seams. The Lord boasted to visiting nobles that his mason worked with the hand of God, but the mason only shook his head. He knew it wasn't miracles that made walls last. It was discipline, patience, the humility to wait for the stone to teach you. He once told an apprentice, "Every wall wants to fall. You don't fight it, you persuade it to stand." The boy didn't understand then. Few ever did. Autumn painted the hills gold again. The river shimmered with the color of iron and flame. The mason sat by the well one evening, sharpening his chisel though he no longer carved. He ran his thumb across the blade's edge and smiled faintly. All tools, like men, wore out. But what they built, if built with truth, might not. He remembered the first day he'd stood on this ground. Back then, there was nothing but grass, mud, and a lord's ambition. Now there was a fortress, alive with firelight and song. He could die tomorrow, and it would still stand. That was enough. As the year waned, the castle grew quiet again. The fields slept. The workers went home for winter. Only the wind remained, curling through the halls, whispering across the stones like an old friend. The mason, too, had grown quiet. He spoke little now, preferring to listen not to men, but to what he had built. Sometimes, standing alone in the courtyard, he would feel the faintest hum beneath his boots. It was not the wind, nor his imagination. It was the settling of time itself, the sound of stone remembering. He knew what it meant. The fortress was no longer new. It had entered its own life, independent of those who made it. And in that realization came peace. By spring, his hands trembled too much to hold a chisel. The younger masons carried on the work, repairing cracks, fitting iron braces, carving crests for the gatehouse. The master simply watched. Sometimes they would ask him to bless the new stones. He would place his palm upon them, close his eyes, and nod. His touch was lighter now, not commanding, but farewell. He spoke once to the steward who stood beside him. I built these walls to outlast war and weather. But what I truly built was memory. When we are gone, this will remind the world that men once knew how to make the earth stand still. That night, as the sun sank behind the western hills, the mason climbed one last time to the tower he had raised with his own hands. It took him long minutes, each step a labor, each breath a gift. When he reached the top, he turned and looked over the valley. The river gleamed silver. The fields stretched endless. The castle below glowed in the fading light, every line, every joint, every stone, speaking the same quiet truth. It would endure. He leaned on the parapet and smiled, not as a builder, but as a man who had glimpsed eternity in his craft. And for the first time, he whispered not to the wall, but to the wind. May you stand longer than my name. May time forget me, but never what we built. The castle had walls now, towers that cut the sky, and gates that closed like jaws of iron. But it was still cold, a shell without breath, a giant asleep. For a fortress to live, it needed more than stone. It needed heat. It needed water. It needed men to bring it to life. The master mason, older now, his beard white as lime, stood beside the new smithy at dawn. The air trembled with the sound of hammers, sharp and clean, echoing between unfinished courtyards. Sparks leapt into the gray sky like stars breaking free from the earth. He watched them rise and whispered, "Now it breathes." The blacksmiths had come from the south, their faces burned from years before the forge. They brought iron, charcoal, and secrets knowledge as heavy as the metal they shaped. They were proud men, rough-spoken, impatient with the slow rhythm of stonework. To them, everything was heat and hammer, timing and instinct. But when they saw the castle's size, its sheer will of granite, even they grew quiet. They walked the inner yard with the mason, running fingers along the cold walls. "This," one said, voice low as thunder, "will need more than gates. It will need a heart." He was right. The forge was built where wind could feed its lungs in a deep alcove between the great hall and the armory. Stone arches sheltered it from rain. Vents above drew the smoke to heaven. Beneath it, channels carried water from a nearby spring, cold veins threading through fire. By day, men worked in sweat and flame. By night, steam rose like ghosts into the moonlight. And for the first time, the castle had sound not of hammers on chisel, but hammer on iron. The sound of endurance being born. The mason visited often. Though he knew little of metal, he understood its kinship with stone. Both demanded patience. Both punished arrogance. He stood near the forge, watching the bellows heave, the iron glow red, then white, then gold. One of the smiths turned to him and asked, "You built these walls. Tell me, old man, why so thick?" The mason smiled faintly. "Because no wall, however strong, can stop hunger or fire, but it can buy time. Time enough for a man to find courage." The blacksmith nodded, feeding the fire with a new breath of air. "Then we'll make you courage in steel." Weeks passed. Gates took shape, each hinge forged by hand, each rivet hammered to perfection. Iron teeth bit into oak doors thick as a man's chest. Chains were woven link by link, heavy enough to lift the drawbridge with the strength of oxen. The mason ran his fingers over one such chain, still warm from the forge. It sang under his touch, a low, metallic hum, alive in its own way. He realized then that the castle's voice was changing. Once it had been the echo of stone. Now it was the heartbeat of metal. In the courtyard, masons and blacksmiths worked side by side. The scent of smoke mingled with the sharp tang of lime. Steam rose from buckets as hot iron met cold water, each hiss like a whisper from another world. Some said it was dangerous to let the two elements, water and fire, live so close. But the mason believed they belonged together. Without one, he said, the other forgets its purpose. The smiths laughed, yet they came to respect his words. For when the walls cracked, it was water that healed them. And when the gates sagged, it was fire that mended them. Beyond the courtyard, wells were being dug, deep shafts lined with smooth stones, descending into the dark earth. Buckets creaked on ropes, dripping cold silver back into the light. The mason watched the water shimmer in the sun and thought of balance. Stone could hold, iron could fight, but only water could endure. He often spoke to the apprentices. Fire builds, water remembers, and it is memory that keeps a castle alive long after its lords are gone. They listened, though not all understood. To them, the castle was labor. To him, it was legacy. As the season deepened, the forge grew louder. Armor began to appear, breastplates for soldiers, hinges for gates, fittings for portcullises. The smiths labored under torchlight, their faces smeared with ash and sweat. Sparks clung to their hair like fireflies. The mason would stand at the threshold, silent, the glow of the forge painting his features in red and gold. He saw in it something eternal, the same light that once danced on the desert walls of Jerusalem, the same heat that shaped Rome's marble, the same human will that refused to yield to the dark. He thought, we were meant to build, not to conquer, but to endure. One night, as the forge roared and the stars burned low, the lord of the castle came down from his chamber. He was a proud man, wrapped in furs and shadow. He stood beside the mason and said, when the fires go out, what remains? The old builder looked at the glowing iron. Stone remains, and the faith that shaped it. The Lord said nothing. He turned to leave, but paused. Do you believe faith can be built? The mason met his gaze. No, he said quietly, but it can be remembered. When morning came, the air was thick with smoke and promise. The forge sang, the wells whispered, and the castle at last began to live. The walls no longer felt like barriers. They felt like ribs protecting a beating heart. For years, the mason had built in silence, raising cold stone against the world. Now, in the heat of the forge and the chill of the well, he felt the first warmth of creation. The water cooled the fire strengthened the stone, and between them, something ancient was reborn, the breath of the castle itself. Winter returned before the walls had finished drying. The sky hung low, the air heavy with the smell of snow and smoke. Within the half-finished castle, men worked in the forge from dawn until darkness, their breath mingling with the rising steam, their hammer strikes echoing like distant bells. The mason moved among them, slower now, but his presence still commanded respect. He had become a relic of his own craft, part of the stone, part of the legend. When he spoke, even the youngest apprentice paused. Do not fight the iron, he would tell them. Guide it. It is stubborn, like the earth, but it remembers who shapes it. The blacksmiths nodded, sweat streaming down their temples. For them, every strike was prayer, and the forge their altar. The great gate was nearing completion. It stood 3 men high, framed in oak and iron, bound by bolts thick as a thumb. When the hinges turned for the first time, the sound rolled across the courtyard, a deep, resonant groan, as if the castle itself were waking from a long sleep. Men stopped working. Even the Lord, watching from the high stair, seemed to hold his breath. The mason touched the stone near the archway, feeling the vibration pulse through his palm. It was alive. This sound, he said quietly, will outlast every song written by man. Deep within the keep, wells now reached water. Chains and buckets dipped below the surface, pulling up cold clarity from the dark. The smiths quenched their blades there, the hiss echoing through vaulted chambers. The mason watched each blade vanish into the water's glow, emerging with new strength, tempered, balanced, eternal. He saw in it the same rhythm he had followed all his life. Fyrkriet. Water refines. Together, they teach endurance. That night, he walked alone along the battlements, watching the moonlight ripple across the moat below. He thought of all that had been born from the union of fire and water, the forge's light and the well's silence, heat and reflection, strength and humility. The castle, he realized, was not just built to protect life. It was life, the embodiment of everything men had learned to master without losing their souls. The following spring brought chaos. Floods from the melting snow washed through the valley, threatening the lower walls. Men scrambled with sandbags, stones, and timber, shouting above the roar of water. The mason, though frail, climbed down to help. He stood knee-deep in freezing current, barking orders with the voice of a commander. Anchor the barrels, reinforce the base, let the water pass, don't fight it. The men obeyed, driven not by fear of failure, but by trust in his voice. By nightfall, the walls held. The castle stood firm while the valley drowned beneath the flood. When the waters receded, the mason leaned against a soaked parapet, chest heaving. One of the blacksmiths found him there and said, half in awe, "You built it to last against war. Did you know it would stand against the river too?" The old man smiled faintly. "No, lad, but the stones did." With spring came renewal. Grass returned to the courtyards. The forge burned again, brighter than ever, the anvil singing like a struck bell. New tools were made: hammers, hinges, locks, and chains for the drawbridge. Every ring of iron against iron echoed up through the towers, merging with the cries of gulls from the sea. The castle had begun to sound like the world outside, a living, breathing part of it. The mason would often stop beside the forge to watch the smiths at work. He admired how their rhythm matched his own, measured, patient, unhurried. Each strike carried purpose. Ach Pause meaning. And in that rhythm, he recognized something ancient, a kinship between builders across centuries. Whether with stone or steel, the hands of men had always sought to shape permanence from the fleeting. As the great hall neared completion, masons carved symbols above the door. A flame, a wave, and a circle enclosing both. When asked what it meant, the old builder said simply, "Fire gives strength, water gives peace, the circle that is memory." The Lord approved the emblem, though few understood its depth. It would remain carved there for centuries, long after the names of those who built it had been forgotten. At dusk, torches flickered in the forge like constellations fallen to earth. The mason sat on a stone bench nearby, warming his hands. The youngest blacksmith approached him, hesitant. "Master," the boy asked, "when this castle is finished, what will you do?" The old man smiled beneath his beard. "Finish? Nothing made by men is ever finished. We only step aside and let time do the rest." The boy frowned. "So the castle will never be complete?" "Not while the wind still blows and fire still burns," the mason said. "Then Zofter, when the last ember dies, then it will rest. Not before." The boy nodded, unsure whether to be comforted or frightened by that thought. Later that night, the mason returned to the forge alone. He ran his hand over the anvil, feeling the heat lingering in the metal. He thought of all the men who had come and gone, the carvers, the haulers, the smiths, the diggers. Their sweat had mixed into the mortar. Their breath lingered in the walls. Each flame, each drop of water, had carried a piece of their soul. He understood then that the castle's true foundation wasn't stone at all. It was memory, the invisible weight of human hands that refused to give up. Outside, the night was still. Snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. The forge dimmed, its light fading into amber coals. The mason watched as a final spark leapt into the air and vanished against the cold. He whispered, almost to himself, Stone remembers the touch, fire remembers the breath, and water remembers everything. He turned, walking slowly toward the gate. Behind him, the forge sighed a long, low breath, as if the castle itself were settling into sleep. By morning, frost had settled across the courtyard, clinging to the gates and chains. The forge was quiet, its heart at rest until spring called it awake again. But even in silence, the castle seemed alive, warm beneath its skin of stone. The mason paused at the entrance one last time. Looking back, smoke curled faintly from the chimneys, and the water in the well reflected the pale Sunday. He felt pride, yes, but also peace. The fire had shaped the heart. The water had cooled the soul. Together, they had given life to something that would outlast them all. At last, the sound of hammers grew faint. The songs of labor faded into the wind, leaving only the quiet breathing of stone. The castle stood complete, a crown of walls, towers, and battlements carved from the bones of the earth. Dawn came like a benediction. Mist drifted from the river, curling through the gatehouse and climbing the stairs. When the first sunlight broke across the eastern hills, it touched the tallest spire, then slid down into the courtyards, glinting off the windows of colored glass. For the first time, the castle drank the light. The mason stood below the great arch, his cloak worn thin, his hands rough and scarred. He had seen this place born from mud and dust, from prayer and exhaustion. Now it towered above him, vast and silent, as though it had been waiting centuries to breathe. He removed his cap and bowed his head. There was no ceremony yet, no trumpet, no crowd, just the quiet understanding between a maker and what he had made. By mid-morning, the Lord and his household arrived, banners raised, armor polished, horses stamping on the drawbridge. Their voices filled the air like a tide of life rushing into stone veins. Inside the great hall, sunlight streamed through stained glass for the first time. The colored panes painted the flagstones in crimson, gold, and blue. On the far wall, the mason's carvings, vines, angels, beasts, and the emblem of flame and wave shimmered in living color. The Lord stood in awe, his breath catching. He turned to the crowd behind him, lifting his hands. "This fortress," he declared, "is not merely a shield. It is my soul-made stone." The mason listened from the shadows near a pillar. He did not smile, nor did he bow. He had heard such words before, proud, loud, fleeting. He knew the truth. A Lord's soul is temporary. Stone belongs to no man. The celebration began. Trumpets rang. Tables groaned under the weight of meat and bread. Minstrels sang of glory and conquest, their notes climbing into the vaulted ceilings where echoes gathered like ghosts. But the mason wandered away. He climbed the spiral stair to the ramparts, where wind and silence ruled. Below him, the castle stretched in perfect geometry, the courtyard a square of purpose, the towers guardians of the sky. He looked down upon the valley, where once there had been only earth and wild grass. Now stood something eternal, something that would defy time, just as men had dreamed since the first stone was ever lifted. He thought of the hands that had shaped it, hands that would never see this sunrise. The quarrymen, the smiths, the diggers, the boy who died when a rope snapped, the woman who brought bread to the walls in winter. Their lives were written into the mortar, unseen but never lost. He whispered into the wind, "This is your day too." Below, the chapel bells rang deep, slow, solemn. The first mass within these walls had begun. The mason descended the tower and entered through the narrow side door, head bowed. Candles flickered in iron holders. The priest's voice rolled low and steady, Latin words blending with the sigh of the crowd. Each syllable echoed from the stone vaults above, as if the walls themselves were answering. When the priest sprinkled holy water upon the altar, droplets struck the carved faces of angels. The mason watched as the water trickled down, catching light, glimmering like tears. He felt something shift, not in faith, but in understanding. The castle had taken its first breath. It was no longer a structure. It was a presence. Every arch, every stair, Every hidden chamber seemed to awaken under the rhythm of the chant. Outside, the wind changed. Crows circled the towers and perched upon the ramparts, their wings cutting through the Sunday. It was as though the world itself had come to witness this awakening. After the ceremony, the Lord approached the mason at last. "You've done what no man has done before," he said. "This fortress will stand until the end of time." The mason nodded, eyes still on the light spilling across the floor. "It will stand until it remembers why it was built." The Lord frowned, uncertain of the meaning. But before he could ask, the old man turned and walked away, his boots echoing down the empty corridor. That evening, silence returned. The guests had departed, the torches burned low. The mason lingered in the great hall alone. He ran his fingers along the carvings on the wall, the same stones he had touched when they were still rough from the quarry. He could feel every chisel mark, every story. And beneath it all, a vibration, soft, slow, steady. The castle was alive. He felt it breathe with the night wind, hum with the cooling of iron, and pulse with the memory of thousands of footsteps. The sound was faint but constant, like a great heart, buried deep within the foundation. He whispered into the stillness, "You've woken, old friend." Outside, the stars shone clear and sharp. The towers caught their light like blades, reflecting silver against the dark. Far below, the moat rippled with torchlight, a living mirror for the heavens. The mason stood at the gate, watching his creation settle into its first true night. He could almost feel the centuries ahead unfolding: wars, kings, storms, silence. All of it would come, and still the walls would stand. He thought of the countless generations who would walk these halls, never knowing the names of those who built them. But he did not feel sorrow. That was the nature of stone, to outlive its makers and still carry their spirit. He smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes deepening like carved runes. "Sleep well," he murmured. "Your time has just begun." Down in the valley, the last light of the Lord's torches faded. The sound of horses and laughter drifted into the distance. But the castle remained silent, resolute, alive, and somewhere deep within its walls, beneath the mortar and the memory, the faint echo of a heartbeat endured. The castle did not belong to the Lord. It belonged to time. Winter settled early that year. Frost crept along the battlements, coating the stone in silver. The wind howled through arrow slits, turning the corridors into hollow flutes that sang to the emptiness. But even in the cold, the castle endured, unmoving, unbroken, eternal. The mason remained within its walls long after the others had left. Servants came and went. The Lord rode to war, his banners fluttering like fire on the horizon. Yet the old man stayed, tending to cracks and weather, oiling hinges, patching mortar where frost had bitten deep. He was not commanded to. He simply could not leave. The castle had become part of him, or perhaps he had become part of it. He slept in a small room beside the chapel, where candlelight flickered on rough plaster. Each night, before sleep, he would lay his palm on the wall beside his bed, feeling the slow heartbeat of stone beneath his hand. It was steady, patient, endless. In the days that followed, the mason began to notice something strange. When the sun rose, the walls glowed not only with light but with warmth, as if they absorbed and remembered it. When the rain fell, the sound changed deep, almost musical. The stones spoke, though not in words. They murmured through their weight, their chill, their echoes. He began to listen more than he worked. To others, he looked like an old fool, staring at walls and whispering to them as if to friends long dead. But to him, the castle was alive, a creature of earth and will, shaped by faith and pain. Once, while repairing a crack in the outer keep, he heard a voice carried by the wind. It was not his own. It sounded like the laughter of a young apprentice, long buried beneath these very stones. The mason froze, his breath hanging white in the air. He waited, and the wind passed, leaving only silence. He smiled. "Still here, are you?" The castle remembered. Every cry, every song, every prayer that had once echoed within it, all of it lived on. suspended in air and dust and time. The seasons turned. Grass grew between the cobbles. Birds nested in the rafters. The mason moved slower now, his back bent, his hair pale as mortar dust. He no longer dreamed of new walls or towers. He dreamed of quiet, the kind only stone understands. He began to realize something that filled him with both pride and sorrow. His purpose was ending. The castle no longer needed him. It could mend itself in ways unseen, rain washing the surface clean, frost sealing the cracks, roots binding the earth beneath. It stood as though it had learned the rhythm of life from those who built it. The mason was no longer its builder. He was its witness. One morning, while walking the ramparts, he saw a group of children in the valley below. They ran across the frost-bitten field, pointing up at the towers, gleaming in the pale Sunday. He could hear their laughter carried on the wind. To them, the castle was a miracle, a mountain made by men. To him, it was memory and mercy. He rested his hands on the cold battlement stones and spoke quietly. "They'll never know who raised you, and that's how it should be." He thought of all the names lost to time, the quarrymen who split the first stone, the cart drivers who broke their backs on the road, the blacksmith whose last breath was taken by the smoke of his own forge. Their blood, their labor, their hope, all of it was still here, carved into silence. By the time spring returned, the mason's body was failing. He could no longer climb the towers or lift his tools. But each morning, he still walked the courtyard, touching the stones like a priest blessing his altar. Sometimes he would stop and close his eyes, feeling the air press against his face. The scent of lime and dust still lingered. The castle exhaled warmth from its walls, as though returning the breath he had once given it. He thought then that maybe this was what immortality truly was. Not in name, not in legend, but in the endurance of what one leaves behind. A wall, a stone, a quiet permanence against the decay of time. One evening, as dusk fell, the mason climbed once more to the highest tower. It took him longer than ever before. He paused often, resting his trembling hands against the walls that had once yielded beneath his strength. When he reached the top, he looked out upon the valley green again, alive, the rivers gleaming like veins of silver beneath the fading light. Below him, the castle stretched in perfect harmony, towers, ramparts, the chapel's spire reaching heavenward. Every line and curve spoke of purpose. Every stone bore the weight of centuries yet to come. He whispered into the wind, "Do you hear them still? The ones who came before us?" The stones seemed to answer with a low, steady hum, the breath of a living thing. The sound wrapped around him like a final blessing. He smiled faintly. Good. Keep their voices safe. He closed his eyes and leaned against the wall, feeling the pulse of the fortress beneath him. For the first time, he felt no burden, no labor, only peace. When dawn broke, the castle stood unchanged. The mist clung low over the valley, wrapping the towers in pale gold. But the mason was gone. In the chapel below, a single candle flickered beside his empty tools. No one could say when he had passed, only that his hands were clean, and there was a faint trace of dust on his palms, as though he had touched the wall one last time. The Lord returned weeks later. He ordered the mason buried within the foundation, beneath the first stone he had laid. No marker was set, no words carved, but those who listened swore that when the wind blew through the great hall, you could still hear the faint rhythm of hammer against chisel. Steady, patient, eternal. The castle did not belong to the Lord. It belonged to time, and to those who gave it breath. Centuries passed. The banners rotted, the names faded, and the wind reclaimed the towers. The castle, once a monument of pride and prayer, now stood as a ruin, half swallowed by ivy and time. No smoke rose from its chimneys. No torch lit its gate. Only the crows kept watch on the parapets, where once men had stood in shining mail. Yet even in ruin, it endured. Its bones, the walls, the vaults, the cold spiral stairs remained firm. The earth had shifted around it. Rivers changed their course, but the stone still held fast to its purpose. It did not mourn. It remembered. A traveler came one autumn morning, walking from the north road through fog and rain. His boots sank into the wet grass of the outer bailey, where sheep now grazed among the fallen stones. He carried no sword, only a satchel of parchment and ink, a chronicler perhaps, or a scholar. His breath rose in pale clouds as he approached the main gate, where the arch still bore traces of carved saints, their faces worn smooth by the centuries. He ran his hand along the wall, feeling the texture rough, uneven, alive. Rainwater seeped from the cracks, glistening like veins. He whispered, almost without meaning to, "Still standing." His voice was swallowed by the mist. Inside the courtyard, silence hung heavy. Grass grew where soldiers had once marched. A tree, tall and twisted, had rooted itself in the center, its limbs clawing toward the sky. The traveler set his pack down beneath it and began to sketch the remnants: the chapel's arch, the broken tower, the half-collapsed keep. As his pencil traced the outlines, he felt a presence. Not a ghost, not a sound, but a weight in the air, as if the walls were watching. The silence was not emptiness. It was memory made solid. He knelt, brushing away the moss at the base of the inner wall. There, beneath the grime and years, he saw it, a faint mark, a mason's symbol carved into the stone. Simple, a circle intersected by a cross. He pressed his thumb to it. The stone was cold, but beneath that coldness he felt something steady, a pulse that was not his own. He lingered for hours, wandering through the corridors where light fell in golden shafts through the broken roof. Birds nested in the cracks. Vines crawled like veins over the arches. Each wall told a story of labor, of devotion, of time itself kneeling before endurance. The traveler took notes, measurements, sketches, small fragments of words. Mortar intact, lime still breathing, tower tilts but holds. He paused often, listening, and each time, when the wind passed through the ruined hall, he could swear he heard something beneath it, a rhythm, faint but constant, like the heartbeat of the castle itself, or the echo of a chisel far away. He closed his notebook slowly. Night came. The traveler lit a small fire in the courtyard and sat beside it, watching shadows climb the walls. The stars began to appear through the hollow windows. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs to places older than memory. He spoke softly, as if afraid to break the spell. "Who built you?" No answer came, but he felt one nonetheless. It was not a voice. It was the whisper of the past, moving through stone and air, carrying words shaped by centuries. He imagined them, the men who carved and hauled, who sweated and bled and believed, the stonemasons, blacksmiths, carpenters, and laborers who never saw their names recorded. Only their hands endured, through the stones they left behind. The traveler reached into his pack and drew out a small bronze trowel, a relic he had found buried near the old quarry months before. Its edge was worn smooth, its handle wrapped in cracked leather. He placed it on the ground beside the fire. "Perhaps," he murmured, "you held this once." The wind rose, swirling through the courtyard, making the flames flicker. The firelight danced across the walls, and for an instant he thought he saw shapes, faint figures moving in the stone surface. Men hauling ropes, turning wheels, shaping blocks with hammer and faith. He blinked, and the vision was gone. Only the wall remained, unchanging, eternal. He lay down beneath the open sky, using his cloak for a blanket. The night pressed close, filled with the scent of damp earth and lime dust. He could not sleep. Something in the air hummed low, steady, like breath beneath the surface of the world. He realized then that the castle was not dead. It was not even sleeping. It was dreaming of the hands that made it, of the prayers whispered between its stones, of the quiet pride of creation. He understood, at last, what the old builders must have known, that no stone was ever truly still. Each one held within it the echo of movement, of touch, of will. Every wall was a memory made visible. He whispered into the darkness, "You remember them, don't you? The wind answered with a sigh that seemed almost human. He smiled faintly, closing his eyes. At dawn, when he rose, the mist had lifted. Sunlight poured through the broken towers, and for the first time, the castle seemed alive with light. He walked once more through the great hall, where grass now grew between the flagstones. In one corner, near the collapsed altar, he saw a small inscription carved deep into the stone, older than the rest, barely visible. "I laid the first stone." He traced the letters with his fingers. The edges were worn smooth, but the words endured. Whoever had carved them had done so with humility, not for glory, but for memory. The traveler felt the chill of the stone against his skin and bowed his head. "Then I'll remember you," he whispered. He left the ruin without looking back, his pack heavy with sketches and pages filled with awe. Behind him, the castle stood silent in the light, unyielding, proud, and at peace. Men die, faith fades, but the stone remembers every hand that built it. Long after the traveler's footsteps faded beyond the hill, the castle remained alone, yet not abandoned. Morning light spilled through the arches, illuminating dust motes that drifted like tiny spirits in the air. The silence was not emptiness. It was memory preserved in stone. Beneath the ruined stillness, the world continued its quiet turning. The seasons came and went, as they had for centuries. Snow softened the broken battlements. Spring draped the walls in vines and flowers. Each year, the castle seemed to breathe anew, as though remembering that it had once been alive with fire and purpose. Far below, where the foundations met the earth, rainwater trickled through the ancient mortar. It followed channels carved by the first builders, thin veins of lime and sand laid by hands long turned to dust. The water carried whispers through the cracks, murmurs of chisel strikes and wooden wheels. Even in decay, the structure was not silent. It murmured softly to the ground, telling its story to the roots that now grew among its stones. If one listened carefully, truly listened, one might still hear the rhythm of labor, the steady pull of rope, the breath of men walking inside treadwheels, the murmur of Latin prayers rising with the dawn. It was as though the castle itself repeated the voices of those who built it, unwilling to let them vanish. Centuries blurred together. The land around the fortress changed. Villages grew, then withered. Kingdoms fell, and new flags flew over distant hills. Yet the castle endured, a relic of faith standing against time's slow erosion. Children who played in its shadow spoke of hearing faint sounds at twilight, the tapping of unseen hammers, the whisper of stone against stone. Old men told stories of the mason who had laid the first stone, saying he returned each century to touch the wall once more before dawn. No one could say if it was truth or legend. In such places, the two had long ago become the same. In one of the upper chambers, where half the ceiling had fallen, the morning sun illuminated carvings hidden for centuries. Spirals, crosses, and simple lines marks of the craftsmen who had shaped the walls. Each symbol was a signature, small and human, yet defiant against time's erasure. Their hands had vanished, but their marks remained a testament not to glory, but to endurance. And as the light shifted across the carvings, shadows formed shapes along the wall faces, perhaps, or memories frozen in motion. For a fleeting moment, it was as if the castle remembered them all. The laughter at midday, the grunts of labor, the quiet prayers whispered between stones. The air was thick with their ghosts, not in sorrow, but in pride. A storm rose one night, fierce and wild. Lightning split the sky above the towers, illuminating the ruin in flashes of white fire. Wind tore through the open halls, carrying dust and fragments of leaves. For hours the rain fell without mercy, drumming against the stone. Yet when the morning came, the castle still stood. The water had washed the walls clean, revealing once more the strength within the old mortar. It was as if the storm itself had come to test the will of those forgotten builders and had found it unbroken. The stone still held. The faith they had mixed into lime and sand still bound it together. In time, the ruin became a place of pilgrimage for those who sought silence, meaning, or simply awe. Writers came with notebooks, artists with canvases, and wanderers with questions they could not name. Each found something in the stillness, an answer, perhaps, or a reminder that not all creation fades with its maker. They walked the same paths the mason had once walked, tracing his steps through the fog of centuries. And though none could hear his voice, they felt it in the air, a steady, unspoken presence that guided their gaze to the walls, the arches, the light. Some knelt before the oldest stones, their fingers trembling as they touched the grooves left by medieval tools. In that touch, time folded upon itself. The living and the dead met in silence. As the centuries turned once more, the castle became a ruin among ruins, a monument less to a lord's power than to the endurance of human hands. Grass and ivy climbed higher, but still, the walls refused to fall. The castle had ceased to be a fortress. It had become something greater, a cathedral of memory, a testament to creation itself. And when the wind blew through its hollow windows, the sound carried not sorrow, but song. The low hum of time, resonating through the stone, whispered to those who passed by, "We built this not for glory, but for forever." Now, when travelers stand before its gate, they pause. They lift their eyes to the weathered towers and feel something ancient stir within them, a quiet reverence, an echo of faith. It is not religion, nor nostalgia. It is the recognition of what humanity once dared to build with bare hands and unyielding will. If you stand there long enough, you may hear it too, the faint echo beneath the wind, like a heartbeat from within the walls. Men die, faith fades, but the stone remembers. And so, as the camera draws back, the castle stands alone in the golden light of evening, its silhouette etched against the horizon. The sky darkens, the world turns. The story ends where it began, in silence, in endurance, in the timeless rhythm of creation. If this story moved something ancient within you, if you've ever looked at stone and felt the weight of those forgotten hands, then share it. Let the story travel once more, as it did centuries ago. Like, share, and subscribe to keep the echoes of the builders alive. For as long as one voice remembers, the stone will still speak.